My fiancé's family humiliated my mother's memory at our rehearsal dinner, so I ended the wedding on the spot. My name is Daniel. I'm 34 years old, and if you had asked me a year ago where I thought I'd be right now, I would have told you I'd be married, settling into a new chapter with the woman I believed was my soulmate. Instead, I'm here, telling a story I never thought I'd have to tell. A story about love, about family, about betrayal, and about the night I realized that walking away was the only way to protect the one person who mattered most to me, even after she was gone. I grew up in a small working-class town, raised by a single mother named Linda. She was everything to me, my protector, my role model, the reason I believed in loyalty and sacrifice. For years, I thought those values would be enough to carry me through any relationship. But love has a way of blinding you. 5 years ago, I met Rachel. She was radiant, confident, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made people stop. Mid-conversation, we met at a charity fundraiser in the city. She laughed at my jokes, I laughed at hers. And within weeks, I was certain I'd stumbled into the kind of love people spend a lifetime searching for. Rachel wasn't just beautiful, was magnetic, and I was hooked. But when you fall for someone, you don't just fall for them, you fall into their world. And Rachel's world was nothing like mine. Her family, the Harpers, lived in a gated neighborhood filled with manicured lawns and imported cars. They wore their status like armor, and I told myself it didn't matter. Love was bigger than class, bigger than background, bigger than money. At least, that's what I believed back then. For a long time, I ignored the signs, the casual remarks, the thin smiles, the subtle reminders that I wasn't one of them. Thought if I just proved myself, if I showed how much I loved Rachel, everything else would fade. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because what started as little differences, little cracks beneath the surface, would grow into a rift so wide it swallowed our engagement whole. And it all ties back to one person, my mother, the woman who raised me, the woman they mocked, and the memory they tried to erase. That's where the real story begins. My mother's name was Linda, and she was the kind of woman you don't forget. She wasn't rich, she wasn't powerful, and she didn't need to be. She carried herself with a quiet strength that turned heads without ever asking for attention. People in our town used to say she had a gift for showing up at the exact moment you needed her most. And for me, she was everything. She raised me alone after my father walked out when I was 8. There were nights when she came home exhausted from her 12-hour shifts as a nurse. But she still found the energy to help me with schoolwork, to cook a warm meal, to make me believe that we weren't missing anything even though we had so little. She taught me that dignity didn't come from money or status, it came from how you treated people when they had nothing to offer in return. My mom had a way of making sacrifices feel like choices. If she had only $10 in her wallet, she'd spend 9 on someone else and laugh like she never needed it. I used to think she was too generous for her own good, but the older I got, the more I realized that generosity was her armor, her way of fighting against a world that hadn't given her much. When Rachel and I grew closer, my mom welcomed her with open arms. At first, everything seemed fine. My mom complimented Rachel's ambition, said she reminded her of herself when she was younger. But slowly, Rachel started to pull away from her warmth. She would make small remarks like, "Your mom's a little too involved," or, "She doesn't know when to step back." They seemed harmless at the time, but they cut deeper than Rachel ever realized. What Rachel didn't see, what her parents never acknowledged, was how much they owed to my mother. Years before, when the Harper family's shiny world started to crack, it was my mom who quietly stepped in to keep them afloat. Thomas, Rachel's father, nearly lost his dealership after a bad financial year. Banks wouldn't take the risk, investors pulled out, but my mom co-signed a loan so he could keep the business alive. Caroline, her mother, never said a word of thanks. Not once. Then came the medical bills for Rachel's grandmother. Insurance didn't cover the treatments she needed, and the family panicked. My mom, the woman they later called meddlesome, put her savings toward helping them through. She didn't just hand over money, she sat with them, explained every form, every invoice, made sure they didn't get buried under debt. And it wasn't only money. My mom spent hours tutoring Rachel's younger brother when he nearly failed his classes. She babysat his kids when he was scrambling to finish night school. She gave them time, energy, and kindness that no one else offered. All of it freely, all of it without expectation. I remember asking her once why she did it, why she gave so much to people who barely acknowledged her. She smiled, the kind of tired smile only she could wear, and said, Because kindness isn't about keeping score. It's about doing the right thing when no one else will. That was who she was. My compass, my anchor. The reason I believed people were better than they sometimes appeared. But the Harpers didn't see her that way. To them, she was background noise, someone who had been useful, but was better left unmentioned. They pretended her generosity was interference, as though she had intruded rather than saved them. And in the months leading up to my wedding, I began to see that truth play out in the smallest, sharpest ways. Which brings me to the first cracks in my relationship with Rachel, the red flags I should have noticed sooner. Looking back now, the signs were always there. At the time, I told myself they were quirks, differences in background, small things that didn't really matter. But those small things have a way of stacking up until they form a wall you can't ignore. Rachel was the first to show me glimpses of that wall. She'd roll her eyes when I mentioned my mum's advice on finances or relationships. She'd mutter that my mum inserted herself too much, or that she didn't know how to let go. The comments weren't loud or cruel, just sharp enough to sting. I brushed them aside, telling myself Rachel was adjusting, learning what it meant to be part of my family. Her parents weren't as subtle. Thomas, her father, loved to lace his sentences with little digs. Over dinner one night, he smirked and said, "Rachel's always been ambitious. She deserves a man who can keep up with her." I laughed nervously, pretending it was a joke, but the message was clear. Caroline, her mother, would pat my hand and add, "At least you're dependable. That's worth something." Dependable, as if I were a loyal dog they had reluctantly decided to keep around. There was one night that still lingers in my memory. We were at a Harper family gathering, surrounded by crystal glasses and catered trays of food I couldn't pronounce. Someone asked how Rachel and I met, and before I could answer, Caroline jumped in. At a charity gala, of course. She was dazzling, wasn't she? And Daniel, well, Daniel was sweet. A little out of place, but charming. The table laughed. Politely. I sat there smiling, my chest burning. Rachel didn't defend me. She didn't even notice the insult buried in her mother's words. The pattern kept repeating. Every time I thought about speaking up, I stopped myself. I told myself that marriage was about compromise, about blending families. If I could just get through the wedding, maybe they'd finally accept me. But deep down, I knew the truth. They didn't see me as Rachel's equal. They saw me as an outsider, a project, someone she was lowering herself to be with. And Rachel, the woman who was supposed to stand by my side, never once told them otherwise. Those early red flags should have been enough to make me pause, to make me question where this road was leading. Instead, I ignored them, convinced that love could smooth over even the roughest edges. I couldn't have been more wrong. Because when it came time to plan the wedding, those subtle cuts turned into open wounds. And the battle over my mum's memory would become impossible to ignore. When Rachel and I started planning the wedding, I thought it would be the happiest time of my life. I imagined late nights talking about flowers, laughing over cake tastings, picking songs that would make the night unforgettable. What I didn't imagine was that every step of the process would feel like a tug-of-war, between honoring the woman who raised me and pleasing the family I was about to marry into. For me, the wedding wasn't just about two people saying vows. It was about weaving my mother's presence into a day she would have loved to see. She wasn't here to watch me stand at the altar, but I wanted her spirit to be felt. I wanted her remembered. The first time I brought it up, I suggested something simple: a small table with her photo and a candle, a quiet tribute tucked in the corner of the reception hall. Rachel frowned like I had suggested something outrageous. "Do we really need that?" she asked. "It'll make people sad. Weddings are supposed to be joyful." I tried to explain that it wouldn't be a shrine, just a reminder, but she waved it away, saying, "It's better to keep the focus on us." I told myself maybe she was right. Maybe grief had no place at a wedding. Still, I couldn't shake the guilt, the feeling that leaving my mum out entirely was a betrayal. Then came the music. My mother loved a particular song, one that she used to play while we cooked together on Sunday afternoons. I thought it would be perfect for the mother-son dance, even if she couldn't be there in person. When I suggested it, Caroline wrinkled her nose. "That doesn't really fit the tone we're going for," she said. "It's old-fashioned. We've already spoken with the band about something more elegant." Elegant. That was their word for everything. Elegant flowers, elegant menus, elegant decor, and by elegant, they meant expensive, grand, and utterly disconnected from who I was, or where I came from. Caroline insisted on a luxury hotel ballroom with chandeliers dripping from the ceiling. She demanded imported orchids instead of the simple roses I had suggested because they reminded me of the bushes in my mother's garden. When I mentioned roses again, she smiled thinly and said, "Linda's taste was quaint. But this is Rachel's day. We can't afford to look small." Every time I tried to carve out a piece of the day for my mom, it was erased, dismissed, overwritten by what the Harpers thought was appropriate. Rachel didn't push back. She didn't fight for me. She just nodded along, telling me I was that her parents knew best. The more I tried to hold on to my mom's memory, the more I felt it slipping away. It was like watching someone take scissors to a photograph, cutting out the most important face. What hurt the most wasn't just the erasure, it was Rachel's silence. She wasn't only allowing it, she was endorsing it. That was when I started to feel the cracks widening. I told myself I could endure it, that once the vows were spoken, none of it would matter. But the truth was gnawing at me. If they couldn't even let me honor my mother at my own wedding, what kind of life was I marrying into? That question haunted me as we moved closer to the big day. And when the rehearsal dinner arrived, the answer came crashing down in a way I could never have imagined. When the Harpers announced they would be hosting the rehearsal dinner, I tried to see it as a generous gesture. Maybe, I thought, this was their way of softening the rough edges, of finally welcoming me into the family. But I should have known better. With them, nothing was ever just a gesture. It was a performance. The dinner was set at their country club, a place I had only seen from the outside. Gated entrance, manicured lawns that looked like they were trimmed with scissors. Valet drivers lined up before the sun even set. Inside, it was all marble floors and chandeliers the size of cars. Waiters in white gloves carried champagne trays as if this were a political fundraiser, rather than a gathering of family before a wedding. The first thing I noticed wasn't the decor, though it was the guest list. When I scanned the room, I saw a sea of Harper relatives and their business associates, lawyers, bankers, colleagues in suits that probably cost more than my car. On my side, there were only a handful of people. My dad, my sister Emily, 2 childhood friends. That was it. For people from my world against 50 from theirs. I asked Rachel quietly why so few from my side had been included. She didn't even look up from her phone. "Your family's small. My parents had to fill the room somehow. It's not a big deal. Not a big deal." The phrase was starting to sound like a mantra she used every time something cut deep. I tried to tell myself it didn't matter, that one night of imbalance wouldn't erase the vows we were supposed to exchange. But as the evening unfolded, it became clearer that this wasn't a dinner, it was a stage. And the Harpers were determined to remind everyone who was in control. Thomas stood near the entrance, greeting guests like a senator shaking hands at a campaign rally. Caroline hovered behind the staff, giving instructions on lighting and seating as if she were orchestrating a Broadway production. They weren't hosting for Rachel and me, they were hosting for themselves. Every smile, every comment, every flourish of luxury was a way to show the world their influence and their taste. I sat at the table, surrounded by voices that all seemed to blend into one another, and for the first time, I felt like a stranger. At my own wedding rehearsal, my dad tried to lighten the mood with a joke. Emily squeezed my hand under the table, but the truth lingered in the air. This wasn't about celebrating love, this was about power. And when the speeches began, that power play turned into something far more cutting. When the plates were cleared and the wine had been poured, the lights dimmed slightly. A waiter tapped a spoon against a glass, and suddenly, all eyes shifted toward the front of the room. It was time for the speeches. I felt a tightness in my chest, the kind you get before a storm. Thomas was the first to take the microphone. He strutted forward with a glass of scotch in his hand and the kind of grin that told me he thought the room belonged to him. He began by welcoming everyone, thanking the club staff, and praising Rachel for being, in his words, a star who has always shined brighter than the rest of us. People clapped politely. Then his tone shifted. He looked in my direction, tilted his glass and said, "And now, she's found Daniel, a man who will, I suppose, keep her grounded." Rachel always reached for the sky, and Daniel keeps both feet firmly on the ground. A ripple of laughter rolled through the tables. Some guests chuckled nervously, unsure if it was meant as a joke. My dad's jaw clenched, and my sister Emily glared at him from across the room. Thomas wasn't finished. He launched into childhood stories about Rachel's drive, her ambition, her perfection. Then came the jab, delivered with a smirk. "We always told Rachel to aim high." And while Daniel might not have been exactly what we pictured, he let the sentence dangle. More nervous laughter. I felt heat creeping up my neck. When he finally sat down, Caroline rose in his place. She glided to the microphone as if she had been rehearsing for weeks. Her voice was sweet at first, dripping with maternal pride. She spoke about Rachel's beauty, her intelligence, her future. Then she turned toward me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "We're so grateful Daniel is joining the family," she said. "Rachel has taught him so much already. Patience, sophistication, how to navigate a world he wasn't used to." Laughter again, this time sharper. My water glass shook in my hand. Caroline pressed on. "But what I admire most is Daniel's willingness to get his hands dirty. He's practical. He'll be a good balance to Rachel's sparkle." The words landed like blows. To them, I wasn't a partner. I was a footnote, the plain backdrop to Rachel's brilliance. And the worst part was the way Rachel smiled along, her eyes bright with amusement, never once speaking up, never once shutting it down. I thought it couldn't get worse, but then Thomas rose again, glass in hand. He said he wanted to honor someone who couldn't be with us that night, my mother. For a brief moment, I thought maybe, finally, he would show a shred of respect. Instead, he smirked. Linda was one of a kind. Always had an opinion. Always had a way of inserting herself into things. Generous, sure, but sometimes too generous. Caroline laughed beside him. She certainly liked to meddle, she added, always insisting she knew best, even when no one asked. The room went silent. Guests shifted in their seats. Some stared down at their plates. My chest tightened, and I felt my hands clench into fists under the table. My mother, the woman who had saved them, who had lifted them up when no one else would, was being turned into the punchline of their little performance. And then Thomas delivered the final insult. "We'll keep her spirit alive, of course," he said, winking toward the crowd. "But let's hope Daniel doesn't inherit her enthusiasm for taking charge. We wouldn't want him meddling too much, would we?" A few chuckles broke the silence, but most people just looked uncomfortable. I glanced at Rachel. She wasn't horrified. She wasn't outraged. She laughed softly, leaned in, and said, "Oh, Dad, stop," as if mocking my mother's memory was harmless fun. In that moment, something inside me snapped. I could no longer sit quietly, swallowing their contempt. The air in the room felt suffocating. And I knew if I didn't stand up now, I would never forgive myself. What happened next would change everything. I don't remember pushing my chair back. All I remember was the sound it made, an ugly scrape across the polished floor that cut through the silence. Heads turned. Forks froze midair. Dozens of eyes landed on me, but I didn't care. My pulse was pounding in my ears. My jaw locked so tight I thought my teeth might crack. I looked straight at Caroline and Thomas. "Are you serious right now?" My voice came out low, almost shaking, but clear enough for the whole room to hear. Caroline blinkered, caught off guard. Thomas leaned back in his chair with that smirk of his, as if I were an entertainer putting on a show. Rachel tugged at my sleeve and whispered, "Daniel, please sit down." But I pulled my arm away. "Let me get this straight," I said, louder now. "You just spent the last 10 minutes mocking my mother, the woman who helped you when no one else would. And now you think it's all just a joke. You think that's funny." A murmur swept through the tables. Some guests shifted uncomfortably. Others stared at their wine glasses. My dad's eyes were locked on Thomas, unblinking. My sister, Emily's face was red with fury. Thomas chuckled under his breath. "Relax, son. It was in good fun." "You're too sensitive." "Good fun." My voice cracked with anger. Calling my mother meddling, mocking her generosity, reducing everything she did for you to a punchline. That's good fun to you. Caroline lifted her chin. Everyone knows Linda liked to take charge. We were just sharing stories. Stories, I snapped. Let's tell the real stories then. About the time my mom co-signed a loan to keep your business alive, when the banks wouldn't touch you. About how she paid for your grandmother's medical bills so she wouldn't be turned away from treatment. About how she tutored your son so he wouldn't flunk out. She saved you, again and again. And instead of gratitude, this is how you honor her. By calling her meddlesome. Gasps broke out. People were whispering now, leaning across tables, their faces a mix of shock and discomfort. Thomas's smirk faded. He sat up straighter, clearly irritated. That's enough, he said sharply. If you're going to throw a tantrum over a toast, maybe you're not ready for marriage. That line hit like a slap. He wasn't just disrespecting my mother anymore, he was belittling me. And Rachel, the one person who could have stopped this, sat frozen in her chair. She didn't defend me. She didn't even look angry. She looked embarrassed at me. I turned to her. You laughed, I said, my voice shaking. They mocked my mother, and you laughed. Her eyes widened. I didn't know they were going to say that, but you didn't stop them. You didn't even try. The room was buzzing now. Whispers, shifting chairs, glances darting between us. Caroline pressed a hand to her chest, like she was the victim. Daniel, this is supposed to be a happy occasion. You're ruining the evening for everyone. I couldn't believe it. I'm ruining the evening. No, Caroline, you ruined it. The second you dragged my mother's name through the mud. And Rachel, I paused, feeling the weight of the words. You let it happen. Rachel's face flushed red, tears pooling in her eyes, but she said nothing. Thomas stood abruptly, pointing toward the door. If you're so offended, maybe you should leave. For a second, I thought about it. I imagined walking out, slamming the door, letting them choke on their arrogance. But then I looked around. My father, my sister, my friends, they were watching me, waiting. And I knew leaving wouldn't be enough. Not this time. I steadied myself, hands trembling, voice rising. No, I'm not leaving. Not until you understand this. My mother deserved better than your cheap insults. She gave you everything without asking for a damn thing in return. And, instead of honoring her, you turned her into a joke. That's not just disrespectful, it's disgusting. Silence fell again. Even the servers had stopped moving, trays suspended mid-air. For the first time that evening, Thomas had no quick retort. Caroline's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. Rachel sat motionless, staring at her lap. In that moment, I knew the night was already broken beyond repair. But what I didn't realize yet was that this was only the beginning. The real decision, the one that would shatter everything, was still waiting. The silence after my words felt heavier than any noise could have. I stood there, chest rising and falling, my heart pounding so hard I thought everyone could hear it. Thomas glared. Caroline looked stricken. And Rachel's eyes shimmered with tears that weren't for me but for the spectacle I had just made. The tension was unbearable, pressing down on me until I couldn't breathe. I turned, pulled my coat from the back of my chair, and walked toward the door. The scrape of my shoes across the floor echoed through the room, each step a rejection of the life I thought I was about to start. My dad rose instantly, his face set with pride more than anger, and followed. Emily stood, her stare fixed on Caroline, before grabbing her purse and falling in step with me. Two of my closest friends hesitated, then pushed back their chairs to follow as well. Behind me, I heard Rachel's voice crack. Daniel, wait please. But I didn't stop. The air inside that club felt poisoned, and the only way to breathe was to leave. The cold night hit me like a shock. I stood on the steps outside, sucking in air, my fists still trembling. My father placed a hand on my shoulder. You did the right thing, he said. Your mother would be proud. Emily nodded firmly, though her eyes glistened with anger. I wanted to believe them. I wanted to feel righteous, victorious even. But all I felt was hollow. Because deep down, I knew walking out wasn't enough. If I left things there, the Harpers would twist the story. By tomorrow, the whispers would spread. Daniel was unstable. Daniel overreacted. Daniel embarrassed their family because he couldn't handle a harmless joke. They would make me the villain. And Rachel, if she didn't already see me that way, would let them know. I couldn't let it end with me slinking out into the night. My mother's name deserved more than a quiet retreat. She deserved me standing tall, not slinking away. I turned back to the glowing windows of the club. I need to go back in, I said. Emily's eyes widened. Are you serious? After all that, I nodded. I have to. If I don't, they'll rewrite the story. They'll say I left because I couldn't handle it. They'll say I wasn't strong enough. And I can't let that be the last word. My dad studied my face for a long moment, then gave a slow nod. If that's what you need to do, we'll back you. I shook my head. No, this part I need to do alone. The thought of walking back into that room made my stomach churn, but my mind was clear. I wasn't going back to argue, and I wasn't going back to beg. I was going back to end it for myself, for my mother, for the life I deserved. I pushed opened the heavy door, and stepped inside. The chatter died instantly, replaced by the hum of whispers and the rustle of chairs as people turned to stare. Rachel was on her feet now, pale and trembling, her lips parted like she couldn't decide if she should scream or sob. Caroline's smile was brittle. Thomas's eyes narrowed with disdain. I didn't look at any of them. I walked straight to the front of the room, heart hammering, and faced the crowd. Excuse me, I said, my voice steady now. cutting through the quiet. "I have something I need to say." The murmurs stopped. Even the staff froze in place, waiting. And I knew in that moment that the next words out of my mouth would change everything. The words had barely left my mouth. "This wedding is off," when the room erupted. Chairs scraped, glasses clinked, and voices spilled into the air, like a wave breaking against rock. Some people gasped, others whispered frantically, and a few simply stared at me, as if I had just committed some unspeakable sin. Rachel's face collapsed into shock. Her hands shot to her mouth, as though she could hold back the reality I had just unleashed. Her eyes filled with tears, but I didn't move toward her. I stood still, steady, forcing myself not to waver. Caroline covered her lips with her hand, feigning devastation, while Thomas leaned back in his chair, his jaw clenched with a mix of fury and disbelief. "Daniel, please don't do this," Rachel finally managed, her voice breaking, but I held up a hand, cutting her off before she could try to patch over what could never be fixed. "This isn't just about tonight," I said to the room, my voice firm enough to carry over the restless murmurs. "This is about respect. Respect for me, respect for my mother, and respect for the values I was raised with. And it's clear I won't find any of that here." The weight of silence followed. Some guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats. Others couldn't look me in the eye. My dad nodded once, proud. Emily's eyes shone with a fierce satisfaction, though her hands trembled in her lap. I turned toward the door and walked out for the second and final time. This time I didn't stop. The next morning, my phone lit up like a storm. Over 100 missed messages blinked across the screen. Rachel's texts poured in first. Long apologies. Short pleas. Endless repetitions of, "I'm sorry," and "we can't fix this." Caroline's messages were dripping with self-pity. "How could you humiliate Rachel like that? She didn't deserve this." Thomas's were sharp and venomous. "You'll regret crossing this family. You embarrassed us in front of everyone." Even distant cousins of Rachel's people I had never exchanged more than a handshake with were chiming in, calling me cruel, selfish, unstable. I didn't respond. By midday, Rachel showed up at my apartment. Her makeup was smudged, her eyes swollen from crying. She stood at the door in the same dress she'd worn the night before, like she hadn't even gone home to change. Her voice shook when she asked, "Can we talk?" I stepped aside, letting her in. She stood in the middle of my living room, twisting her hands together, unable to meet my eyes. "I know you're angry," she said softly. "You have every right to be. But we can work through this. My parents went too far, I admit it. I'll talk to them. I'll make them apologize." I stared at her, waiting for something more. For the first time since the disaster at the club, I wanted to believe there was still a chance. But then she said the one thing that told me everything I needed to know. "I just didn't want to cause a scene." She whispered, "Cause a scene." That was her explanation. Not that she didn't agree with her parents. Not that she was too shocked to speak, but that she didn't want to disturb the illusion of a perfect evening. My mother's name, my dignity, my pain, they were all secondary to appearances. I shook my head slowly. "You laughed, Rachel. You laughed while they tore her apart. And you didn't stop them because you were afraid of a scene. Then what about me? What about us?" She broke down, sobbing into her hands. But it was too late. I felt something inside me close, like a door that could never be opened again. I walked to the front door and held it open. "I can't do this anymore," I said quietly. "This isn't love. It's fear, and I deserve better." She froze, her face blotchy and wet. For a moment, I thought she would fight, scream, demand. But instead, she nodded through her tears and walked out into the hallway, the sound of her heels echoing until it faded into silence. For a brief moment, I thought that was the end. But I was wrong. Because a few weeks later, I discovered something missing. Something that would ignite the final betrayal. For a while after Rachel walked out of my apartment, I felt something I hadn't felt in months. Peace. It wasn't happiness. Not yet. But a calmness, like I had finally stepped off a ship that had been sinking beneath me for too long. I poured myself into work, into long walks with my dad, into quiet nights flipping through my mum's old keepsake box. That box was my anchor. Inside were the little treasures she had held onto across the years. The necklace she wore every Sunday, her favorite earrings, and the simple gold wedding band she had left me before she died. She told me once, "One day, when you know it's right, you'll pass this on." But one Saturday afternoon, as I opened the box, my heart stopped. The ring was gone. I pulled everything out, setting each piece on the table, the earrings, the necklace, The photographs, my hands trembling as I searched again and again, praying I had missed it. But it wasn't there. My chest tightened. I knew exactly where it had gone. Rachel, she had come by a week earlier to return the engagement ring, claiming she wanted closure. She'd asked to use the bathroom before leaving. At the time, I thought nothing of it. But now the truth hit me like a blow. She hadn't just returned something that night. She had taken something to Dot. My fingers shook as I typed out the message. Did you take my mom's wedding band? Minutes dragged by. Finally, her reply came. What are you talking about? I gritted my teeth. Don't play dumb. The ring is gone. You're the only one who's been here. There was silence. Then another message. I borrowed it. I just wanted to keep a piece of her with me. To feel closer to you. Borrowed. The word burned through me. That ring wasn't jewelry. It was legacy. It was my mother's life. Her love. Her promise. All pressed into a circle of gold. And Rachel had slipped it into her purse, as if it were a trinket. I called her. Immediately, she answered with a trembling voice. Daniel, it's not a big deal. I was going to give it back. Not a big deal. My voice cracked with fury. That ring has been in my family for generations. My mother trusted me with it, and you thought you could just take it without even asking. I just wanted something to hold on to, she whispered. I didn't think you'd notice. That was the final nail. Of course I noticed, I said, my voice low and cold. And the fact that you thought I wouldn't, that's the problem. She started crying then, the same kind of tears I had seen too many times before, but I wasn't moved. I demanded to know where it was. Between sobs, she admitted, it's at my parents' house. I didn't want to lose it, so I left it there. I drove over within the hour. My hands gripped the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles went white. When I pulled into their pristine driveway, the anger inside me had hardened into resolve. Caroline opened the door, her smile faltering the moment she saw my face. Daniel, she said cautiously, what are you doing here? I'm here. For the ring, I said flatly. Rachel told me it's here. Her eyes narrowed. Ring. Why would Rachel? Before she could finish, footsteps pounded on the stairs. Rachel appeared, her face streaked with tears, holding the band between her fingers. It dangled in the light, so small, so delicate, yet it carried the weight of my entire past. Here, she whispered, extending her hand. I snatched it away, gripping it tightly, as though it might vanish again. For a moment, I just stared at it, making sure it was real, making sure it hadn't been tarnished by her touch. Then I slid it into my pocket and looked at her for the last time. You didn't just disrespect my mother's memory that night, I said, my voice steady, cold. You tried to steal it. That tells me everything I'll ever need to know about you. Rachel broke down, her sobs echoing through the hallway. Caroline placed a hand on her daughter's shoulder, glaring at me, as if I were the villain. Thomas stood behind them, arms crossed, expression stone. None of it mattered anymore. I turned and walked out, slamming the door behind me. In the days that followed, I blocked Rachel's number, ignored every attempt she made to reach me, and cut every thread that tied me to that family. The ring never left my pocket. For weeks, I carried it with me everywhere, running my thumb along its surface whenever doubt crept in. It reminded me of what real love looked like, what sacrifice meant, and why I had to walk away. And slowly, painfully, I began to feel free. But freedom isn't the same as healing. And the path forward, my path toward building a life not defined by their betrayal but by my mother's love, was only just beginning. The days after I reclaimed my mother's ring felt strangely quiet. No more endless phone calls, no more texts filled with apologies or threats, no more pleading at my door. For the first time in months, the silence wasn't heavy, it was clean, almost cleansing. I kept the ring close, slipping it back into the old keepsake box where it belonged. Every time I opened that box, I could almost hear my mother's voice, steady and warm, reminding me of the man she raised me to be. Not a man who bows to power, not a man who stays silent when loved ones are disrespected, but a man who stands tall, even if it means standing alone. Ending the engagement wasn't the future I had imagined. I had pictured a wedding, a home, children laughing in the yard. But what good is a future built on a foundation of silence and shame? If Rachel couldn't defend me or my mother's memory when it mattered most, then the marriage would have been a slow death by 1,000 cuts. I realized walking away wasn't losing a life I could have had, it was saving the life I still deserved. In the weeks that followed, I began to rebuild. Small things at first. Dinners with my dad, long talks with Emily, quiet evenings where grief no longer drowned me. Friends who had seen what happened reminded me I wasn't crazy, that love isn't supposed to make you feel small. And every day that passed, I felt a little lighter, a little more like myself again. There are still moments when the what-ifs creep in. What if Rachel had spoken up? What if her parents had shown an ounce of gratitude? What if things had turned out differently? But then I run my thumb across my mother's ring, and I remember, love without respect isn't love at all. It's compromise dressed as commitment. Walking away from that rehearsal dinner wasn't the end of my story. It was the beginning of one where I finally understood my worth. My mother's legacy lives in me, not in the approval of people who never deserved her kindness, but in the choices I make to honor her strength. And maybe that's the lesson in all of this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do is walk away, even when the world expects you to stay. So I'll ask you this. If you were standing where I stood surrounded by people who laughed at the person you loved most, would you stay seated? Or would you walk out and never look back? And that was the night everything changed. Walking away wasn't easy, but it was the only way to honor my mother and protect my own dignity. Sometimes love means holding on, but sometimes the bravest love is letting go. If this story moved you, don't forget to leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the next story.